A frantic phone call, my neighbor's voice trembling. "She's destroying it all, Liam. Your mother's garden, it's gone." Then a single, chilling image sent to my phone, a backhoe tearing through roses, the soil raw and bleeding. But what they didn't know was the secret buried beneath those petals, a secret the state of California would pay anything to unearth. The call came on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, listless day in Seattle that made Liam miss the relentless California sun he'd grown up with. He was elbow-deep in code, debugging a persistent glitch in a new software build, when his phone buzzed against the polished surface of his desk. It was Mrs. Gable from next door, her name flashing in a font he associated with frantic texts about escaped cats and packages delivered to the wrong address. He almost ignored it. "Liam, thank God." Her voice was thin, stretched taut with a panic that instantly coiled in his gut. "Liam, you need to come home. Something terrible has happened." "Mrs. Gable, what's wrong? Is everything okay?" He swiveled in his chair, the half-written line of code forgotten. "It's Carol," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if the woman in question might be listening. "Carol Peterson, she's done something awful." Carol Peterson. The name landed like a stone in his stomach. President of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association, a woman who wielded her power like a freshly sharpened scythe. She was the reason his mother had spent the last year of her life in a constant state of low-grade anxiety, a battle of passive-aggressive notes and thinly veiled threats over the height of hedges, and the precise shade of white for the window trim. "What did she do?" Liam asked, his voice tight. There was a choked sob on the other end of the line. "The garden, Liam, your mother's garden, it's gone." The words didn't compute. Gone. The garden was his mother's legacy. It was a riot of color and life, a testament to her 30 years of coaxing beauty from the stubborn California clay. It was where she'd taught him the difference between a weed and a wildflower, where she'd spent her final, pain-filled months finding a semblance of peace. It couldn't be gone. "What do you mean, gone?" "She hired a crew, with a backhoe, Liam, a backhoe. They tore it all up this morning. The roses, the lavender, the big oak tree, everything. It's just dirt now. Raw dirt." A cold, sharp fury pierced through the fog of his disbelief. He was on his feet, packing the small confines of his office, the city skyline a blur outside his window. "She can't do that. It's my property." She said the HOA approved it, something about a fire break, a new regulation. She had a piece of paper, waving it at anyone who tried to stop her. Mrs. Gable was crying now, soft, helpless sounds. "I'm so sorry, Liam. We tried to call you sooner." He didn't hear the rest. The blood was roaring in his ears, a tidal wave of rage that threatened to drown him. He hung up, his hand trembling as he jammed his laptop into his bag. He told his boss it was a family emergency, that he had to leave immediately. He didn't wait for a response. The drive from Seattle to Oak Creek, California, was a 14-hour blur of caffeine, rage, and grief. With every mile that spooled out behind him, the image of his mother's garden grew more vivid in his mind. He saw her on her knees, hands plunged into the soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a smile on her face. He smelled the heady perfume of the peace, roses she'd planted the year he was born. He felt the rough bark of the oak tree he'd climbed as a boy, its branches a canopy against the summer heat. He pulled onto his street late Wednesday afternoon, his heart hammering against his ribs. The manicured lawns and identical beige houses of the Oak Creek community had always felt sterile to him, a stark contrast to the wild, vibrant chaos of his mother's garden. But now, as he rounded the final corner, the sight that greeted him was worse than anything he could have imagined. It was a scar, a raw, gaping wound in the earth where a paradise had been. The lush green lawn was gone, replaced by churned, muddy soil. The towering oak tree had been reduced to a jagged stump, its roots clawed from the ground and left exposed like severed nerves. Of the roses, the lavender, the carefully tended beds of native California poppies and lupins, there was nothing, not a single petal, not a single leaf. In the center of the devastation, a pristine white sign had been hammered into the ground. Future site of the Oak Creek Community Drought-Tolerant Demonstration Garden. Approved by the Oak Creek HOA Board. Liam stumbled out of the car, his legs unsteady. The air, usually thick with the scent of jasmine and rose, smelled only of diesel and damp earth. He walked to the edge of the destruction, the soft soil sucking at the soles of his shoes. A profound, hollow emptiness opened up inside him. It wasn't just a garden. It was the last living piece of his mother, and Carol Peterson had ripped it out by the roots. He saw a flicker of movement from the house next door. Carol's house. The curtains in her front window twitched, and he knew she was watching him, savoring her victory. The rage returned, hot and blinding. He started towards her front door, his fists clenched, a primal scream building in his chest. But then he stopped. Screaming and yelling wouldn't bring the garden back. It would only give Carol the satisfaction of seeing him broken. It would make him the unstable son of the eccentric woman who didn't follow the rules. No, he had to be smarter than that. His mother had taught him to cultivate patience, to wait for the right moment to act. He took a deep, shuddering breath and turned his back on Carol's house. He walked the perimeter of his ravaged property, his programmer's mind kicking into gear, overriding the grief. He took out his phone and began documenting everything. He photographed the tire tracks from the heavy machinery, the mangled stump of the oak tree, the smug HOA sign. He zoomed in on the property line, a line Carol had clearly and deliberately crossed. As he was filming, Mrs. Gable scurried across her lawn, a plate of cookies in her hands and a look of deep pity in her eyes. "Liam, dear, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the wreckage. "She's a monster, a vindictive, power-hungry monster." "Did she give a reason?" Liam asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A real reason?" Mrs. Gable wrung her hands. She claimed the garden was a fire hazard, that the oak tree was a danger to her foundation. All lies, of course. This was about your mother, Liam. Your mother stood up to her, challenged her at the HOA meetings. Carol has been waiting for a chance to get back at her, even after, well, you know. Even after she was gone, the words hung in the air between them. This wasn't just an act of spite, it was a desecration. "She left this in your mailbox," Mrs. Gable said, pulling a crisp envelope from her apron pocket. "It's a fine for non-compliant landscaping." Liam took the envelope. Inside was a letter, printed on official HOA letterhead, detailing his violation and levying a fine of $500. It was signed with a flourish by Carol Peterson, president. The letter was dated the day before the destruction. She had fined him for a garden that no longer existed. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I'll handle it." He spent the rest of the day on the phone. He called the county, the police, and 3 different lawyers. The responses were dishearteningly similar. It was a civil matter, an HOA dispute. The police wouldn't get involved. The lawyers were sympathetic but expensive, with no guarantee of success. The HOA, they explained, had its own set of rules, its own private government. The contract his mother signed when she bought the house gave them broad, sweeping powers. Defeated, he sat on his front steps as the sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the barren earth. He felt a despair so profound it was almost paralyzing. Carol had won. She had erased his mother's memory, and there was nothing he could do about it. It was then that he remembered. A conversation from years ago, his mother kneeling in the dirt, her hands carefully tending a patch of delicate, bell-shaped flowers. He asked her what they were. "They're special, honey," she'd said, her eyes twinkling. "They're called Franciscan wallflowers. They only grow in a few places in the world. They're endangered." He'd been a teenager, more interested in video games than botany. "So, what's the big deal?" She had looked at him then, her expression serious. "The big deal, Liam, is that they're protected, by law, by the state of California. It's illegal to disturb them. They're more powerful than any HOA. She had patted the soil around them. "This is our little secret, our insurance policy against women like Carol Peterson." A jolt, electric and fierce, shot through him. He scrambled to his feet and ran to the garage, his heart pounding with a new, wild hope. He found his mother's old gardening journals tucked away in a dusty box. He flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing her familiar, elegant script until he found it. A detailed map of the garden, every plant meticulously labeled. And there, in the back corner near the base of the old oak tree, was a small, shaded area marked with a star. Uracemum franciscanum. He grabbed a shovel and a flashlight and went back outside. The air was cool now, the sky a deep, stardusted indigo. He walked to the back corner of the lot, to the spot where the mighty oak had once stood. The ground was a mess of upturned roots and churned soil. It looked hopeless. But his mother had been a clever woman. She knew the flowers were delicate. She had planted them inside a buried terracotta container, a small, hidden sanctuary. He paced the area, using the property line and the position of Mrs. Gable's birdbath as reference points, just as the journal described. He dug for nearly an hour, his muscles screaming in protest. The shovel hit something hard, not a rock. It was the smooth, curved edge of the terracotta pot. It was shattered, broken into pieces by the backhoe's relentless blade. His hope withered. He was too late. He dropped to his knees, plunging his hands into the cool, damp earth. He felt through the soil, his fingers searching for any sign of life. He found only shredded roots and crushed stems. Carol just removed the garden. She had annihilated it, pulverizing everything in her path. And then his fingers brushed against something small and delicate. Tucked beneath a large piece of the broken pot, miraculously shielded from the destruction, a single, tiny seedling. It was no bigger than his thumbnail, with two fragile green leaves pushing their way up through the darkness. It was alive. He stared at it, a lump forming in his throat. It was so small, so vulnerable, yet so defiant. A tiny, living testament to his mother's foresight, an insurance policy. A weapon. Carefully, reverently, he scooped the seedling and the surrounding soil into his hands. He took it inside, placing it in a small pot on the kitchen windowsill, a silent promise passing between him and the memory of his mother. The next morning, Liam made a phone call, not to a lawyer, not to the police, but to a number he found on the website for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. He was put through to a woman in the Native Plant Protection Division. He explained the situation, his voice steady and precise, detailing the destruction of his garden and the presence of the endangered Franciscan wallflowers. He sent her the photos he had taken, the pages from his mother's journal, and a close-up of the tiny, surviving seedling. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the woman spoke, her voice laced with a cold, professional fury that mirrored his own. "Mr. Henderson," she said slowly, "the California Endangered Species Act has some of the strictest penalties in the country. What your HOA president has done is not just a civil matter. It's a state crime, a serious one." She continued, "We will be opening an immediate investigation. An agent will be at your property this afternoon. I would advise you not to speak with Ms. Peterson. Do not answer your door. Do not respond to any calls or letters. Let us handle it." A slow smile spread across Liam's face. It was the first time he had smiled in 2 days. He looked at the seedling on his windowsill, its two small leaves reaching for the sun. The wheels of justice were turning, and they were about to roll right over Carol Peterson's drought-tolerant demonstration garden. At precisely 2:00 p.m., a dark green Ford Explorer with an official state seal on the door pulled up to the curb. A woman with a no-nonsense haircut and eyes that missed nothing stepped out. She wore a practical khaki uniform with a California Department of Fish and Wildlife patch on the sleeve. She moved with an air of authority that made the meticulously enforced neighborhood conformity seem flimsy and childish by comparison. Liam met her at the edge of his property. "Agent Miller." "Mr. Henderson." She gave him a firm, brief handshake, her eyes already scanning the churned earth. "Let's see what we're dealing with." For the next hour, Liam walked Agent Miller through the devastation. He showed her his mother's journal, the laminated pages filled with notes and drawings. He pointed out the exact location of the shattered terracotta pot. She took soil samples, measured the depth of the backhoe's gouges, and photographed every angle of the destruction. Her expression was grim, her questions sharp and to the point. "Your mother knew what she was doing," Miller said, looking at the journal with a kind of professional reverence. "This documentation is incredible. It's a clear chain of evidence. She established a habitat, and she knew its significance." She then looked at the small pot Liam had brought out from the kitchen, the tiny seedling a fragile speck of green against the brown soil. Miller crouched, examining it with a small magnifying glass she produced from her pocket. "Uracemum franciscanum," she confirmed, her voice low. "No doubt about it, it's a miracle this one survived." She straightened up, her gaze shifting to the house next door. The curtains twitched again. "Okay, Mr. Henderson, I have what I need for a preliminary report. Now I'm going to have a conversation with your neighbor." A local police cruiser, requested by Miller, arrived moments later. A young, stoic officer got out and stood by as Miller walked up the perfectly paved walkway to Carol Peterson's front door. Liam watched from his porch, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Carol opened the door with a wide, saccharine smile, the kind she reserved for public HOA meetings right before she shut down a homeowner's request. "Can I help you?" she chirped, her eyes flicking from Miller's uniform to the police officer and finally to Liam, a flicker of triumphant malice in her gaze. "Carol Peterson?" Agent Miller asked, her voice flat and official. I am I'm Agent Miller with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I need to ask you a few questions about the landscaping work you ordered on this adjacent property." Miller gestured to the wasteland of Liam's yard. Carol's smile tightened. "Oh, it's a simple HOA matter. The property was in violation of our landscaping bylaws. We have full authority to rectify such issues. It's all in the covenants." She sounded smug, practiced, as if she'd rehearsed this very speech. "I'm not here about your covenants, Ms. Peterson. I'm here about California Penal Code, Section 3511, Miller said, her voice cutting through the pleasantries. "Are you aware that the property you had excavated is a designated habitat for a state-listed endangered species?" The color drained from Carol's face. "A what? That's ridiculous. It was a patch of weeds and eyesore." "It was a cultivated colony of Uracemum franciscanum, the Franciscan wallflower," Miller countered, her tone like ice. "We have extensive documentation provided by the previous owner proving the plants were here. We have soil samples confirming their presence, and we have a surviving specimen." Carol sputtered for the first time, losing her composure. I had no idea. How was I supposed to know? It's not my responsibility to know every single weed in this neighborhood." "Ignorance of the law is not a defense, Ms. Peterson," Miller said, "especially when the action is this egregious. You hired a commercial landscaping crew with heavy machinery. You authorized the removal of topsoil to a depth of 3 feet. You destroyed an entire microecosystem." Carol's face, which had been pale, was now turning a blotchy red. "This is harassment. I am the president of the Homeowners Association. I was acting in the best interests of the community." "The interests of the community do not supersede state and federal law," Miller stated calmly. She pulled a folder from her briefcase. "Under the California Endangered Species Act, the unpermitted destruction of a single protected plant can carry a fine of up to $25,000 and a year in county jail." Carol's jaw went slack. She stared at Miller, speechless. "We estimate, based on the previous owner's journal, that the colony contained between 40 and 50 individual plants," Miller continued, her voice relentless. "You do the math, Ms. Peterson. We're looking at potential fines well over $1 million. And given the deliberate and vindictive nature of this act, the DA's office will likely be pursuing felony charges." A small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather on their lawns, drawn by the official vehicles and the raised voices. Mrs. Gable stood on her porch, her hand over her mouth. The smug HOA sign in the middle of Liam's yard seemed to mock Carol, a monument to her spectacular miscalculation. "Furthermore," Agent Miller said, delivering the final blow, "effective immediately, this entire property is now under the jurisdiction of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It is considered an active crime scene and a potential restoration site for a critically endangered species." She turned and nodded to the police officer. He went to his car and retrieved a roll of yellow tape and a metal stakes. "All work on your demonstration garden is to cease immediately," Miller commanded. "This land is now a protected habitat. Nothing gets planted, nothing gets moved, nothing gets touched without a permit from my office. Any violation of this order will result in your immediate arrest." Carol stood in her doorway, her perfectly coiffed hair seeming to wilt. Her face was a mask of disbelief and horror. She watched, utterly powerless, as the officer began to hammer stakes into the ground around the perimeter of Liam's yard. He strung the yellow tape from stake to stake, a bright, bold line separating Carol's pristine, orderly world from the consequences of her actions. From his porch, Liam watched the woman who had terrorized his mother, the woman who had destroyed his last connection to her, crumble. Her power, built on the flimsy foundation of bylaws and fines, was nothing against the authority of the state. She had wanted to erase his mother's legacy, but instead she had enshrined it. She had turned a private garden into a state-protected sanctuary. The final insult came when another state vehicle pulled up. 2 workers began unloading official signs, much larger and more permanent-looking than Carol's flimsy HOA placard. They began bolting them to the stakes along the yellow tape. The signs read, "Protected Wildlife Habitat, Unlawful to Disturb, VIOLATORS subject to prosecution under California state law, CESA Section 2080. Carol Peterson was now the proud owner of a home directly adjacent to a government-quarantined crime scene. Every morning, she would wake up and look out her window not at her triumphant drought-tolerant garden, but at a barren, fenced-off field of dirt. A constant, public reminder of the day she picked a fight with a dead woman's flowers and lost. The yellow tape and official signs transformed Liam's yard from a private tragedy into a public spectacle. The quiet, beige street became a hub of activity. Cars slowed down as they passed, the drivers gawking at the government warnings. Neighbors, who usually only interacted through polite, distant waves, now gathered in small, whispering clusters on their driveways. The iron grip Carol Peterson had on the community was, for the first time, showing cracks. The first crack appeared in the form of a casserole dish. Mrs. Gable brought it over the evening after Agent Miller's visit, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "The whole neighborhood is talking," she said, her voice a low, excited hum. "Frank from down the street, the one she fined for having a basketball hoop that was 2 inches too high, he said he's framing the violation letter, calls it a badge of honor now." Over the next few days, a quiet rebellion began to brew. One neighbor, a retired accountant named Mr. Henderson, approached Liam while he was checking his mail. "My wife and we wanted to thank you," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Carol strong-armed the board into a 5-figure contract to repaint the community mailboxes last year. The contractor was her brother-in-law. The paint started peeling in 6 months." He handed Liam a folded piece of paper. "It's a copy of the invoice. Your mother was asking about it before she passed. I think she was onto something." Liam took the paper, a new piece of the puzzle clicking into place. This was bigger than a personal vendetta. It was a pattern of abuse, of self-dealing and intimidation. He had stumbled into a war his mother had already been fighting. Meanwhile, Carol was not taking her public humiliation lying down. 2 days after the signs went up, a letter was slipped under every door in the neighborhood. It was an announcement for an emergency HOA meeting to be held in the community clubhouse. The agenda: addressing the recent hostile government overreach and the slanderous accusations against our president. The meeting was pure theater. Carol stood at a podium, flanked by a stern-looking man in an expensive suit, her lawyer. She had traded her usual smug demeanor for a carefully crafted performance of a wounded public servant. "My friends, my neighbors," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Our peaceful community has been invaded. A disgruntled homeowner, using a deceptive and unproven claim about a common weed, has sixed the full, intimidating force of the state government on us. On me." She painted a picture of herself as a martyr, a brave volunteer working tirelessly for the good of the community, now being persecuted by a vindictive young man and a power-mad bureaucracy. She spoke of property values, of the danger of letting one person's unruly yard dictate the rules for everyone else. "This isn't just an attack on me," she declared, her voice rising. "It's an attack on our way of life, on the very principles of this community. That is why the board has voted to use our community's legal defense fund to fight this injustice." A murmur went through the crowd. The legal defense fund was supposed to be for lawsuits against the HOA, not for defending the president's personal legal battles. Mr. Henderson, the retired accountant, stood up. "Carol, are you saying you're using HOA dues to pay for the lawyer defending you from potential felony charges?" Carol's lawyer stepped to the microphone. Ms. Peterson was acting in her official capacity as president when she authorized the landscaping. Therefore, the HOA is obligated to provide for her defense. "She was acting on a personal vendetta against a dead woman," someone shouted from the back. The room erupted. For the first time, people weren't afraid to speak up. Voices rose, airing years of pent-up grievances, unfair fines, opaque financial decisions, arbitrary rule changes. The carefully controlled order of Carol's meetings dissolved into chaos. Liam, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, watched it all unfold. He hadn't said a word, but he didn't need to. The seeds of dissent his mother had sown, and which he had inadvertently watered with a single phone call, were now in full, glorious bloom. He left the meeting before it descended into a full-blown riot and went home. He spent the rest of the evening in the garage, going through boxes of his mother's old files. He found what he was looking for in a folder labeled simply HOA. It was all there: copies of invoices like the one Mr. Henderson had given him, notes from board meetings with sections highlighted where the official minutes had been altered, emails from other homeowners complaining about Carol's tactics. His mother had been building a case meticulously and patiently. She hadn't just been fighting for her garden, she'd been fighting for the whole neighborhood. The centerpiece of her collection was a set of documents concerning the large, undeveloped parcel of land at the edge of the community. The HOA had sold it to a developer for a shockingly low price 2 years prior. The developer was a company called Peterson Properties, Carol's husband's company. She had pushed the sale through, claiming the land was unusable, a fire risk. Now a luxury condo complex was being built on it. Liam sat back, the papers spread out on the dusty floor around him. The destruction of the garden wasn't just spite. It was a calculated move. His mother's oak tree, the one Carol had claimed was a danger to her foundation, had provided a beautiful, park-like view for the back units of that new condo complex. But his mother's messy garden, with its native plants and wildflowers, didn't fit the manicured, upscale aesthetic the developer was selling. And his mother, with her questions and her research, was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Carol hadn't just been trying to erase a memory, she'd been trying to cover her tracks. The next morning, Liam received a thick envelope via process server. It was a lawsuit, not from Carol, but from the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. They were suing him for damages to community property value and for filing a frivolous and malicious report with the state. They were demanding he pay the HOA's legal fees and a punitive fine of $100,000. It was a desperate, reckless move, a legal Hail Mary designed to intimidate him into backing down. But as Liam looked at the lawsuit, then at the box of his mother's files, he felt a profound sense of calm. Carol thought this was a battle over a plot of dirt. She had no idea it was a war she had already lost. He picked up his phone and called Agent Miller. "Agent Miller," he said, "I think I've found something you and possibly the district attorney will find very interesting. It seems my mother's garden wasn't the only thing Carol Peterson was trying to bury." Agent Miller listened intently on the other end of the line, the silence punctuated only by the scratch of her pen. When Liam finished explaining the contents of his mother's files, there was a long pause. "Mr. Henderson," she said finally, her voice tight with a new level of seriousness, "what you're describing is a potential RICO case. This goes far beyond environmental crimes. You've uncovered a pattern of systemic fraud and corruption." She took a deep breath. "I need you to secure those files. Don't talk to anyone else. I'm making a call to the DA's Public Integrity Unit. This is their jurisdiction now." The wheels of justice, which had been turning steadily, now accelerated with breathtaking speed. The next morning, 2 plainclothes detectives from the district attorney's office were sitting in Liam's living room. He walked them through his mother's research, spreading the invoices, altered minutes, and property deal documents across the coffee table. They listened, their expressions hardening with each new piece of evidence. They took the entire box of files with them, leaving Liam with a receipt and a grim promise to be in touch. The counteroffensive was swift and overwhelming. 2 days later at dawn, the quiet street of Oak Creek was flooded with official vehicles. This time, it wasn't just the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It was the DA's office, the FBI, and the IRS. Armed with search warrants, they simultaneously raided Carol Peterson's home, the HOA clubhouse, and the corporate offices of Peterson Properties. Neighbors peered out their windows, clutching coffee mugs, as investigators carried out box after box of documents, computers, and hard drives. Carol, clad in a silk bathrobe, her face a mask of rage and disbelief, was escorted to a waiting car for questioning. Her husband, a man who had always carried himself with the smug assurance of untouchable wealth, was led out of their home in handcuffs. The story exploded. The local news, which had already been sniffing around the edges of the endangered flower dispute, now descended in full force. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs lined the street. Reporters did live stand-ups in front of the yellow-taped crime scene of Liam's yard, which had become the unlikely epicenter of a massive public corruption scandal. The HOA, as an institution, imploded. The other board members, who had been Carol's loyal rubber stamps, suddenly found themselves targets of a federal investigation. One by one, they resigned, issuing panicked statements through newly hired lawyers, claiming they had been misled by Carol, that they had no knowledge of any financial impropriety. The frivolous lawsuit against Liam was dropped so quickly it was practically an afterthought. Carol's carefully constructed world was being dismantled, piece by piece, in the most public way imaginable. The DA's office, using the evidence his mother had gathered, secured a court order to freeze all personal and corporate assets belonging to the Petersons. Their bank accounts, their properties, their investment portfolios, all locked down pending the outcome of the investigation. The luxury condo complex, now linked to a fraud investigation, saw its funding dry up. Construction ground to a halt, leaving a half-finished skeleton of a building as another monument to Carol's greed. Isolated, abandoned by her allies, and financially paralyzed, Carol was a prisoner in her own home. The only time she left was to meet with her increasingly expensive lawyers. The smug, powerful HOA president was gone, replaced by a haggard, frantic woman who jumped every time a car door slammed in the street. Liam watched it all from his mother's house, a quiet observer of the storm he had unleashed. He'd given his statement to the DA, handed over the evidence, and now his part was done. He spent his days tending to the single, precious wallflower seedling on his windowsill, which was growing stronger, its leaves unfurling in the California sun. About a month after the raids, a certified letter arrived. It wasn't from a lawyer or the HOA. It was from the state of California, a joint notice from the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Environmental Protection Agency. Liam opened it, his hands steady. It was the final judgment on the environmental case. The state had levied the maximum possible fines against Carol Peterson personally, not the HOA, for the destruction of the 47 documented plants. The total came to $1,175,000, but that wasn't the part that made Liam's breath catch in his throat. It was the second paragraph. The state was also issuing a formal remediation order. Under the provisions of the Endangered Species Act, the party responsible for the destruction of a protected habitat was also responsible for its complete restoration. The order was brutally specific. Carol Peterson was now legally and financially responsible for restoring Liam's property to its previous state, under the direct supervision of a state-appointed biologist. She was required to source and purchase mature, native plants, including a 15-foot oak tree from a specialty nursery. She was required to pay for the installation of a new irrigation system and for the specialized soil and nutrients needed to recreate the garden's ecosystem. And the final, most exquisitely ironic detail. She was required to fund a state-run program to cultivate 500 new Franciscan wallflower seedlings from the single surviving plant. These seedlings would then be replanted in the restored garden, creating a new, larger, and permanently state-protected sanctuary. The woman who had tried to pave over a garden with a soulless, drought-tolerant patch of gravel was now legally bound to spend her own money to resurrect it, to make it more vibrant and more protected than it had ever been before. She would have to watch, every single day from her window, as the paradise she had destroyed was painstakingly brought back to life, a living symbol of her utter and complete defeat. The state hadn't just fined her. They had sentenced her to witness the triumphant return of everything she had tried to bury. The restoration began in the spring. The first sign was the arrival of a state-appointed landscape architect, a woman with a sun-weathered face and an encyclopedic knowledge of native California flora. She worked from Liam's mother's journals, treating them like sacred texts. For 2 weeks, trucks came and went, delivering tons of rich, dark soil to replace the nutrient-stripped clay Carol's backhoe had exposed. Liam watched the process from his mother's kitchen window, the same window where the lone seedling, now a thriving young plant, sat in a pot. He had quit his job in Seattle. He told his boss he was taking a sabbatical, but he knew he wasn't going back. His life was here now in this house, overseeing the rebirth of his mother's legacy. The day the new oak tree arrived was a neighborhood event. It came on a massive flatbed truck, its root ball the size of a small car. A crane was brought in to lift it and settle it into the exact spot where its predecessor had stood for 50 years. Neighbors came out onto their lawns, not in whispering clusters, but in a celebratory gathering. Mrs. Gable brought lemonade. Mr. Henderson, who had been elected the new interim HOA president by a landslide, stood beside Liam, watching the tree being lowered into the earth. "It's a new beginning," the old accountant said, his voice thick with emotion. "For this yard and for all of us." Carol watched, too. Liam could see her silhouette in her front window, a dark, motionless shape behind the glass. She hadn't been seen outside since the remediation order was posted. Her husband had taken a plea deal, agreeing to testify against a ring of corrupt city inspectors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The RICO case was still pending, but the U.S. Attorney's Office had already seized their half-finished condo complex under asset forfeiture laws. They were ruined. But for Liam, the most satisfying punishment was the one happening right outside her window. Every day, she was forced to watch as a team of gardeners, their salaries paid from an account the court had garnished from her assets, painstakingly recreated the beauty she had tried to obliterate. They planted roses along the fence, laid down sod, and installed lavender bushes that would soon perfume the air. The final step was the reintroduction of the Franciscan wallflowers. Agent Miller came in person for the occasion, bringing with her several trays of delicate seedlings. The single plant from the windowsill had become the progenitor of a new generation, cultivated in a state greenhouse. "Your mother was a remarkable woman, Mr. Henderson," Miller said as she and Liam knelt in the soil, carefully placing the small plants into the ground around the base of the new oak. "In a way, she saved this species. This new colony is the largest and most genetically robust one in the state. We're naming it the Henderson Sanctuary." As they worked, Liam felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling that had been absent since his mother's death. The rage that had driven him for months was gone, replaced by a profound, quiet satisfaction. He wasn't just rebuilding a garden, he was finishing his mother's work. He was tending to her memory. A year later, the garden was in full bloom. It was a riot of color and life, more vibrant than it had ever been. The oak tree had taken root, its leaves providing a dappled shade. Bees buzzed among the lavender, and the air was sweet with the scent of roses. And in the back corner, a carpet of delicate, bell-shaped yellow flowers bloomed in the shade. The Henderson Sanctuary, a permanent living testament to a quiet, stubborn woman who had planted an insurance policy in her backyard. The for sale sign went up in Carol's yard on a Tuesday, almost 2 years to the day since the backhoe had arrived. The bank had finally foreclosed on the house. Liam watched from his porch as a moving truck pulled away, carrying the last remnants of the Petersons' life in Oak Creek. He never saw Carol's face. That evening he sat on his back patio, a glass of iced tea in his hand, and looked out at the garden. The setting sun cast a golden light on the flowers, and for a moment he could almost feel his mother there beside him, her hands in the soil, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and a smile on her face. She hadn't just fought a battle against a petty tyrant. She had cultivated a legacy of resilience, proving that even from the most brutal destruction, life, in its most tenacious and beautiful forms, will always find a way to grow back, stronger than before.